Hello, this is Jared from Commit to Quality, and in this video we're going to go over Playwright tests annotations. So Playwright offers test annotations to deal with things like failures, flakiness, skipping tests, focusing on tests, running in parallel, and a bunch of different options. It is worth noting that annotations can be used on a single test, a group of tests. You can even have more than one annotation at a time, and annotations can also be conditional, and I'll go into a little bit of detail of that when we go over the skip annotation. To start it off then, I want to go over the grouping of tests. I'm not going to talk much about this because I have a video out on this already. I'll put a link in the description and there'll be a link on the screen now so you can go view the grouping tests video. But basically, what the test.describe, so .describe does, is a way of grouping your tests. For more information, like I said, go view that video. Now, what I want to move on to is focusing tests. So with Playwright test, we have an option to say .only, and this will only run the tests that have this .only annotation added. So, for example, we've done it to the group of tests here. So like I said just now, we can do it to a group of tests or to a singular test. So outside of this group, I'm actually going to create another test and name it 3. Now what we should see is when I execute these tests, only the 2 tests inside this describe block should run because it's marked with the only annotation. So let me write npx playwright test. If you're following along as well, make sure you only have one config, one project in your config, so you don't see multiple tests running. And here we go, you got the 2 tests using 2 workers, and that's simply doing group of tests, which is the describe block, and then running test 1 and test 2, and you'll see that test 3 has not been run because we've now scoped out execution to using the .only annotation. Now if I was to add only onto this one, it would execute all 3 of the tests. And same again, if we had multiple test files and we had a group of tests in here with .only and a group of tests in another one with .only, it'd run the tests from both files marked up with the only annotation. So there we are, we've got running 3 tests using 2 workers, all looking good. What you've seen here is adding the only to the describe, so the group, and you've seen it applying only to a specific test. Like I said, we can remove it from here and you can do it inside a test inside the grouping as well. So in this case, the only test that's going to run is this one. Even though it's inside the group of tests, we've scoped the only to this specific test inside that group. So if I hit enter and execute, we should see only one test is going to run. Perfect. So that's the only annotation. That's how you can focus your tests. And like I say, you can use this across multiple test files. Playwright config scaffolding also comes out of the box with forbid only as well. So something I make a mistake of quite a lot in my day-to-day role is I'll leave an only annotation in when I'm about to commit some work. And this is good because this will fail the build on CI if you actually left your test.only in the source code. So it's really interesting. That comes out of the box when you set up Playwright using the scaffolding options. The next annotation I want to go over is the skip annotation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove the .only from the test, and I'm going to say I want to skip this test. And to do that, I can do .skip, and now what's going to happen is this will skip. I should have mentioned this earlier in the only annotation as well, and anything else is if you just hover over them, they'll give you a description of what they're doing as well. So it says it's declaring a skip test, and it's saying skip test and never run, and that's exactly what would happen. So if I execute my tests now, what we're going to see is we'll have one test skipped, and the other 2, so 2 and 3, will be executed. So it's going to run 3, but 1 will skip. There we are. So number 1 is skipped because it's turned blue, and you can see that. And we'll see at the end in the logs as well. So there we are, 2 passed and 1 skipped. In the introduction to this video, I stated you can use conditional options as well in your annotations to say, maybe I want to skip this test for a given reason. And we can do exactly that. So let's remove that from here. And inside this test, I'm going to say test.skip. And then I can do, tell you what, we'll add the browser name fixture to this, which all this does is output the name of the browser we're on, and we'll say browser name is equal to Chromium. Then we want to skip it. You can also add descriptions to this to give kind of more information. So we can say this test should not work on Chromium, or not run on Chromium. Great, so I'll save that. And what we say now is, if we're running using Chromium, then we want to skip the test. If it's not Chromium, it'll execute it, and that's where you can use the kind of conditionals, and you can use this in a bunch of different annotations. So let's run this, and we should see the exact same outcome, where you've got 1 skip test and 2 passed, because we are currently running in Chromium, and that's coming from my project down here. There we are, Chromium, skip that one, and these 2 will execute, and you see there that exact same outcome. Now, what if I change this to WebKit? What will actually happen is the test will now execute, because it'll look at this line and it'll say, well, my browser name is Chromium, not WebKit. So now, if I run these tests, we should see it's not going to skip any, and all 3 will be executed. There we go. So those 2 run, and then 3. So 3 passed. So you can see you can add whatever you want into this. I've used browser name because there's a very simple explanation, but you can tailor this to whatever you want. And this is how you can start adding kind of these conditional statements into your tests for specific things. Like I said, this is an example on skip, but you can also do it on plenty other annotations like fix me or anything else you want. You can look at the Playwright documentation, or as I always say, leave a comment below, and I'm happy to provide future videos or just answer questions in the comments. Similar to the skip annotation, we also have a fix me annotation, and it does the same thing, but we're marking it as saying this test needs to be fixed for whatever reason. So let's change this back to Chromium, and we'll say, maybe the description would be on this one, there is a bug raised, and you've got a bug number of whatever the number would be. If I now execute this test, what we should see is test 2 and test 3 go into execute normally, but when it hits this conditional statement of test.fixme, it's going to basically skip it again and abort the test. There we are. We can see it's skipped on there, and the other 2 have run. But it's given us a bit more context to say, instead of just saying skip the test, we can say this needs to be fixed. And once again, this can apply to the test annotation as well. So you don't have to have conditional. But what I'm showing here is you have the option to change it. So if I just save that and re-execute, the same thing will happen where it's going to skip the test because we've marked it as fix me for whatever reason. Perfect, exactly what we said. The next annotation I want to go over is the fail annotation. So let's remove fix me, and inside the test, I want to say test.fail. And what this annotation does, I hover over it, and it unconditionally marks a test as should fail. So Playwright will actually execute this test, and it'll make sure it does fail. And it gives you a perfect example here as well. This is going to be useful for your kind of documentation purposes, to acknowledge that you might have some functionality broken and you want to make sure that it doesn't or have, a false positive. Instead, if it did have the false positive, it's still marked as a failure because you're expecting that test to fail. It's a really cool one. So let's execute this. And what we should see is, even though there's nothing on this test to fail, it will fail because we have this annotation added to it. So like we say, really good for those kind of documentation purposes. There we are. So that one's failed. Even though we know that there's no assertion, no reason to fail, you see down below, expected the test to fail, but it passed. So that could lead us to think, oh, maybe it's been fixed. Or it might be a false positive and there's something not correct in your test, or maybe your assertion is missing. Could be anything, but it's just a really good way to make sure that the test is doing what you expect and also documenting what you're expecting to fail. Then kind of moving on to the topic of, poorly written tests, the slow annotation. So let's hover over it and see what it says. It unconditionally marks the test as slow. So it's going to output your test as slow, but also the key point is slow tests will be given triple the default timeout. In our Playwright config, we should have a timeout value here. So we've got a 30-second timeout value. If you mark a test or even a group of tests as slow, what this would do is turn the 30 seconds into triple the value, which would obviously be their 90 seconds. So we can save that. You're not going to see anything really wrong with this because we don't have any timeout values in here or anything to fail. But if we did have something failing, waiting on a specific web element or anything, what you're going to find is that 30-second wait has just extended to a 90-second wait. So you didn't see any difference there, but if we were to wait on a web element, it'd wait that triple of whatever the timeout value is. It is worth mentioning that you can't use the slow annotation inside a before each or after each hook. You'd have to use the set timeout. So if we hover over this, you can see there's a note down the bottom to explain exactly that. You can't use it in before all or after all. You should use the test.set timeout method instead. We can go over that in more detail. Any questions, I can put something in the comments below for you. So I think it'd be a good example to show you how it's working. So let's say await page.locator. Let's pick a random locator that won't be there, and we'll say .click on this. So this should actually cause the test to timeout. What I do want to do is put this default timeout down to something like 5 seconds because I don't want to be waiting 90 seconds on here. So without slow, what we should see is it times out within 5 seconds. And actually what we'll do, we'll use .only, so we're only scoping it to this test. So it makes a bit more sense. So let's say npx playwright test should now only execute test 1. And we should be expecting a timeout because this locator shouldn't be visible and we shouldn't be able to click anything. Okay, great. So that's our expected failure. And we can see test timeout of 5,000 milliseconds or 5 seconds, which has come directly from our config. Now, without changing anything in the config, I'm just going to re-add test.slow in, and we're going to rerun the test. And what we should see is that timeout value now is going to wait for 15 seconds because that's triple the value. More than likely, I'll end up speeding this up so you haven't got to wait the 15 seconds with me. Okay, there we are. So if I scroll up, you can see now it's waiting for that 15 seconds because we've marked this test as slow. And that's only applying to this given test because it's inside the scope of that. Before I end this video, the last thing I want to go over is running things in parallel. So to do this, I'm going to remove the .only and the slow. We can remove this locator as well. And I want to create a group of 2 tests. So I want to say that's 1. Let's just copy this again and change group of tests 2, and we'll keep that as test 1 because it doesn't matter because it's scoped inside of this. Now, what I want to explain is in the config file, if we don't have this fully parallel as true, tests inside the same file will not run in parallel. So if I run npx playwright test, what you'll see here is it's running the 2 tests using only 1 worker. That's of course because I removed the fully parallel option. If you have that, then everything will run in parallel. You're going to have cases where you might have multiple tests, and if you're relying on things like setup and teardown, parallelization might not want to be what you exactly want in all of your tests or only in specific ones. So one thing we can do is we can add the .parallel annotation onto these. Now we can say is we want these tests to run in parallel inside this test file. So if I now say npx playwright test again, what we should see is we're going to be running 2 tests using 2 workers instead of 1 because we've added this parallelization option onto the described blocks or the grouping of tests. Now, I'm going to be putting out a video for parallelization to kind of go over what we're going over here and also the fully parallel option, the pros and cons. But I wanted to add this into this video because I think it's very useful, especially if you're not having the fully parallel option in your configuration. So I hope that was useful. Like I always say, it's always going to be good to go through the documentation to have even more examples of what you can do. The more we go through more Playwright test videos, you're going to be more exposed to the use of annotations. Like we've just gone through a few different combinations of what you can do. We showed how you can use describe and dot only and describe and dot parallel and all these kind of options, but there's plenty more. So if you find yourself needing to do something or not understanding something in the documentation, please leave a comment, because then I can put a video out on it, or I can just help you in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching and have a great day.